Today's video is going to focus on ancient China. Um, like I mentioned in the video on India, we have a sort of a table of contents. From that video, we looked at India. Today, we're going to look at China. Tuesday, we'll be looking at a combined focus of Japan and the Korean Peninsula. And then in the last video on Thursday, we're going to be sort of wrapping things up, looking at the Dark Ages in Europe and the remnant of what's left of the Roman Empire in West after the fall of that empire in 476 AD. Let's just jump in. Let's just get started. The first thing we need to do whenever we look at a new people group is we need to look at the geography. And the geography of ancient China is essentially going to focus on river valleys, the Xionghe or the Yellow River and the Changjiang. Now, a lot of these words are a little bit difficult for Westerners to pronounce, and I know I'm going to butcher a lot of them, but try to stay with me. They're very commonplace to them. So we're the ones with the struggle, not them. Anyway, it's going to be a river valley civilization. The other component that you need to be aware of looking at the geography of the area that will be ancient China is they have something in common with the Egyptians, and I want to explain. In China, you have to the south the Himalaya Mountains. To the north, you have the Gobi Desert, which is not really a sandy desert, but it's a rocky, barren wasteland, kind of like the moon. And then to the west, you have the Tian Shan and the Kunlun Shan Mountains. Now, as a result of the boundaries to the south, the north, and the west, China will be allowed to develop in almost isolation for hundreds of years. Very, very much like Egypt. If you remember, Egypt had the four natural defenses. You've got the delta to the north, the cataracts, those rapids on the river itself to the south, and then the Sahara Desert to the west and the Great Eastern Desert to the east. And for hundreds of years, the Nile River Valley was left to sort of develop without any outside influence. Well, that's going to be the case in China as well. You'll have the ocean on one side over on the east, and then to the south, west, and north, there are natural boundaries which allow the Chinese to develop their society, their civilization, in almost total isolation. This is why the Chinese refer to their part of the world as the Middle Kingdom, the center of the world, because they are isolated from everybody for so very, very long. It is also important for us to know farmland. We know that every ancient civilization was agrarian based. Now, some of the ancient civilizations that we've looked at will grow out of that. The Indus River Valley civilization and the Mauryan and Gupta empires in ancient India, for instance, will sort of grow out of complete and total reliance just on subsistence farming. The Roman Empire, strangely enough, in the West, never did. Rome was always an agrarian economy. Early on, the issue in China is going to be twofold. Number one, you have to farm near the rivers. Now, the Xionghe is about 2,900 miles long, and the Changjiang is about 3,900 miles long. Only the Amazon and the Nile rivers are longer. So we're talking about some pretty massive rivers. The Yellow River in particular, though, the Xionghe, it's known as China's Sorrow. And the reason it's called that is because of the tremendous flooding that took place. There have been millions of people over the centuries who have been killed by these floods that seem to come from out of nowhere. Take the situation that was in effect on the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in Mesopotamia and magnify that, because these floods were devastating and dangerous. And the catch is, and the reason why they're so dangerous and so frightening, is because if you live in early ancient China, you live near the rivers to farm, where the rivers, when they're not violent floods, will bring that silt, that rich soil up onto the banks, and then when the water recedes, that's a really good place to farm with all the nutrients left. Well, if you build there, specifically if you build your homes around there, you live in a very dangerous area because those floods come out of nowhere sometimes. So millions of people had died as a result of being so close to these rivers that are so prone to these violent floods. The other thing I want you to keep in mind about China's geography is that only 1/10 of the land can be farmed. We have learned that if there's something rare and people desire it and they need it, they're going to fight for it. And so if you want to see the early warfare from the first dynasties in China, look at where the farmland is, because the fighting to control that and to consolidate power around controlling that is going to explain a lot of the politics and a little bit of the economics of ancient China. Now let's talk about the dynasties. In India, we looked at empires. Rome had an empire. In ancient China, we're going to break it down into technically four. The first one we're going to talk about is the legendary dynasty, but anyway, 4 or 5 dynasties. Now, as we remember, a dynasty is a line of rulers from the same family. Some of them, such as the Zhou Dynasty, will exist in continual effect for over 800 years. That's amazing. Others are not quite as long-lived, and one will just have one king, or emperor, I should say. The first Chinese emperor, and we'll get to him in a minute. But we're going to talk about the political, economic, and social structures, social a little bit with the philosophies at the end, but we're going to talk about the political and social structures in terms of dynasties. So let's take a look at the dynasties of ancient China. The very first one that the textbook mentions, that I'm going to mention, we don't know if it actually existed. The founder of the dynasty is called the Xia, or I call them the Xia, Xia. I'm positive I'm mispronouncing it. But the Shang Dynasty existed around 2000 BC. Listen for it. According to legend. Now, the legends about the Shang Dynasty are, some of them are, they seem to be rooted in some archaeological evidence, maybe. The Yu the Great, Yu the Great, was the Shang ruler who was credited for creating channels off the rivers, the Yellow River, to divert some of the flooding and save some of the lives. There might be some archaeological evidence of that. In other words, there could be some sites where, hey, this could be what that is. The problem with the Shang Dynasty is that there is no historical evidence. In other words, the Shang are more than likely prehistoric, before the invention of writing. So I have to mention the Shang Dynasty as the first, but please keep in mind, easily at the writing of the textbook, and even today, there's not a whole lot of solid historical evidence backing up the existence of Yu the Great. For instance, Yu the Great supposedly used dragons to create these channels to divert the floodwaters of the river. Probably not. Anyway, the next dynasty that we're going to look at has a little bit more credibility historically. There's some historical records, there are documents, and they are the Shang, from 1750 BC to 1045 BC. The Shang are going to have they're going to be responsible for building the first cities in China. The capital will be at Anyang. They are also going to be credited with being the first dynasty of rulers to rule over a China that began to mass produce bronze. And Chinese bronze works in the ancient world, especially in the Shang and the Zhou dynasties, are going to be some of the most amazing works of bronze in the ancient world. And as we remember, bronze is copper and tin, which means that they had mining and they had job specialization. So we're definitely talking, if we're heading for that civilization mark, they've got cities, they've got writing. Their religion is going to be primarily ancestor worship, and we're going to talk about that at the very end of the video. But they did have a religion. Whether or not the Shang had a complex religion that would satisfy that feature for the 8 features of civilization, I'm going to leave that up to the historians. But the Shang dynasty come after the legendary Shang. So you've got Shang, then the Shang. from 1750 BC to 1045. Now, as is the way with dynasties, with when you have one person in charge of a monarchy, eventually you're going to have a line of rulers that fall out of favor with the people, and that's what happens to the Shang and a lot of the others afterwards. From the last ineffective, unpopular rulers of the Shang to about 1045 BC, you see the rising of another group of people. These will be the Zhou. The Zhou will have the longest continual dynasty in Chinese history. And they will go from about 1045 BC up to the period of the Warring States. And a little bit through this, it gets tough to figure out where exactly do you cut that off. And I'll explain when we get to the period of the Warring States. But you have the Shang, the Shai, then you have the Shang, then you have the Zhou. The Zhou will also continue with bronze works. They will create a system and refine a system that the Shang started of as their lands got bigger and bigger and they needed a way of controlling the people and collecting the taxes and keeping the laws. The Shang and then the Zhou after them will use a system that might not be the best idea. They're going to employ a system of warlords. A warlord is a person who has their own army, and you take those people and you put them in the provinces around your kingdom, and they are supposed to enforce your laws and collect your taxes and keep the peace and be loyal to you, the king. Now, we can see the flaw in this idea from a long way away. What you think is going to happen will happen. These warlords, later aristocrats, the position will become hereditary, passing from fathers to sons. They will become very strong, very powerful, with very effective armies. Some of these warlords at the latter Zhou Dynasty period, some of these warlords, aristocrats, will have armies that are bigger than the emperors, are bigger than the kings, rather. These provinces will look almost like rival kingdoms. And eventually that is what happens. It's difficult. So you've got the Shai, maybe they existed. Then you've got the Shang, then you've got the Zhou. Now, in the 400s BC, and this is in the Zhou Dynasty, in the 400s BC, you're going to have a situation where these aristocrats, which is pronounced warlords, these aristocrats will begin fighting among themselves for control over land and area and to gain power. They will ignore the Zhou king and treat him as someone who is inconsequential, because by the 400s BC, they've all got armies that can rival the kings, if not outnumber the kings. And this starts a 200-year period in Chinese history from, and I'm going to be real loose with these dates because it's difficult to clock the beginning of it. We're going to say the early 400s BC up to around 220 BC. That period of time, we're going to call that the period of the Warring States. This is when a lot of Chinese philosophy is going to be developed, and we'll talk about it at the end of the video. And the reason is because this is a very, very bloody, dangerous time. The brutality of the period of the Warring States is, it's tough to do a PG-13 version of this. Entire villages, men, women, and children are wiped out. The battles are not just huge on the scale of armies fighting one another, but they're brutal. There's no control over these states. It is, imagine a multi-person civil war. If you had a country, put that in air quotes there. You had a country, but there were 7 or 8 different factions inside that country that are fighting for power and dominance and control. And one leader who's completely ineffective and ineffectual and can't do anything about all of this chaos. That's the period of the Warring States. It was a bad time. It was a very, very bloody time. It was a difficult time. The period of the Warring States, and that's why it's difficult for me to be able to say, when did the Zhou rule end? The period of the Warring States is a testimony to the fact that if you're still going to say that the Zhou ruled during the period of the Warring States, they had no control over anything but their own lands. If you say they didn't, then the Zhou's rule ended in the 400s BC. But during the time, the period of the Warring States, all of the little provinces which have become states in the political arena are now vying to figure out who's going to be in charge. And it will be in 221 BC when the leader of the Qin, Qin, the leader of the Qin state, will, using his massive cavalry, defeat everybody. Everybody. And the Qin Emperor will become not only the winner of the period of the Warring States, but the Qin Emperor is going to be credited with being the first emperor, not just a king, not with the dynasty, but the first emperor of China. He unified all of the Warring States. He did this in a very, very violent, brutal, authoritarian way. The textbook plays it down. We'll talk about the philosophy of legalism toward the end of the video, but the first Qin emperor followed the philosophy of legalism, and he was brutal. Anyone who disagreed with him was punished or executed. Books that said things that he didn't like, he had them burned. He created a political office called censor. And these censors would go out into his empire and make sure that government officials were doing their job. He took the power away from this hereditary line of aristocrats, which were, in the end, generals that he was fighting against. And he put his own people in charge. And only the emperor could decide who was going to be over the provinces. He also created the first currency, a unified currency for China. There were a lot of construction projects creating a canal that connected northern and central China. And it is his tomb that it's literally in chapter 1, page 1, you will see a picture of an archaeologist holding the head of a terracotta warrior. You've seen pictures of the tomb where there are all of these rows and rows of hundreds of clay statues of soldiers. That's the first Qin emperor's tomb. When they discovered this tomb in the 1970s in China, they began excavating it, and then they stopped. There are several now. If you want to get on the internet and find some interesting things to look at, the tomb of the first Qin emperor is definitely the kind of thing that archaeology students and history students love to learn about. One of the reasons that they're hesitant, I'll throw this in there, one of the reasons that they're hesitant to open that tomb is because supposedly, according to the information that they have, there is a map of all of the Qin Emperor's lands, a huge map in the tomb. And all of the water, the ocean and the rivers and everything in the tomb, all of the water represented on that map is mercury. Which, of course, would look cool, but is extremely poisonous. Now, how much is in there and what has happened to it over time, and if they go into it, will they release toxic fumes and kill a bunch of people out in China? I don't know what would happen. But the first Qin Emperor's tomb is a remarkable study in how one person wanted to be remembered for all of time. Now, the first Qin Emperor was authoritarian. He followed legalism, which I'll discuss in just a second. And he said that his would be the final dynasty of China. He died in 210 BC. and he is the only one. There is no Qin dynasty. There's one Qin emperor over unified China, and that's it. He was such a harsh and authoritarian leader that the people rebelled, and a new leader came, and a new dynasty started in 206 BC, the Han Dynasty, H-A-N, the Han Dynasty. And this dynasty will get us into the ADs. The Han rulers will rule from early 200s BC all the way up to about 220 AD. They will bring in the civil service with civil service tests, government positions that will be salaried, that you actually had to sit down and pass a test if you wanted to have that job. There was no more favoritism. There was no more, you're this guy's son or you're this guy's daughter, so I'm going to put you in this job. It didn't work like that. Under the Han Dynasty, you had to pass a civil service test. And the Han Dynasty also necessarily increased education, because education was the way that you could get one of these civil service jobs, by being really, really good and scoring high on these tests. The Han Dynasty will end around 220 AD, and from there, the high school should be able to pick it up. There's a lot more to talk about, but those are the dynasties that I want to cover in this video. You got the Shai, maybe. You got the Shang. You got the Zhou. You got the period of the Warring States. You've got the First Qin Emperor, and then you've got the Han. Closing thoughts and comments. There are three philosophies that will come out of China that your textbook talks about, and I think they're worth mentioning definitely. And they come during the period of the Warring States, because people are very interested in ways to get people to live peacefully. This was a very, very violent and difficult time. There are three we can talk about. There's Confucianism with Confucius, Daoism, and then there's Legalism with Han Dynasty. Confucianism is a philosophy that focuses on remembering the value of ancestor worship and your responsibility and your duty. Everybody needs to put the needs of their family and their community above their own needs. This was a very, very popular philosophy in the courts of the warring states, because these kings of the warring states liked the idea of their people putting the needs of the community, of the state, above themselves. Confucianism is still studied today. It's a very, very interesting philosophy, and again, it has to do with duty, responsibility, ancestor worship, and keep your promises. Be a person of honor. Everyone should live in a way that is an example to others. Then you have Daoism. Daoism is almost, it comes across, let me be careful here. Daoism comes across as almost Buddhist. We need to live in harmony with nature, Daoism taught. By the way, the word Dao means the way. Now, from the Shang Dynasty, certainly into the Zhou Dynasty, but from the Shang Dynasty, they believed that leaders had to follow the way, or the Tao, to keep the mandate of heaven. The mandate of heaven was the idea that the gods wanted wise people to rule, and if you won battles and had good crops and there were no rebellions, you got the mandate of heaven. If there's bad crops, if you lose battles, if there are rebellions, you may have lost the mandate of heaven. But the leader should follow the way, and the idea of Daoism is following the way, letting go of earthly possessions and living in tune with nature, a little hippie. And the final philosophy that I want to mention is legalism. Legalism is what the First Qin Emperor followed, and essentially legalism teaches that humans are evil. They're all rotten. They require strict laws and harsh public punishments. And it was extremely popular during the period of the Warring States with the rulers of these different provinces and states, because it doesn't take any, you don't have to be very smart to punish everybody. You don't have to have any political ability to say, it's my way, I'm going to tie you to that pole and beat you. Legalism was what the First Qin Emperor used, that was the philosophy of the First Qin Emperor, and it's also why he is the only one. There is no dynasty, there was just one, because he was so harsh and so authoritarian, people just couldn't put up with it. Last thoughts, and then we'll stop, I promise. Chinese writing. Chinese writing is a combination from the very, very beginning examples in the Shang Dynasty. Chinese writing is a combination of pictographs, which is pictures that stand for objects, and ideographs, which is connections or combinations of pictographs that stand for objects or people or ideas. And the earliest examples of Chinese writing have been found in what are called oracle bones. An oracle bone is an early Shang dynasty, maybe even pre-Shang, even though it would be prehistoric. But anyway, the early Shang dynasty, religious leaders would scratch a question on a bone, usually a turtle shell. Then they would take a hot rod, like a piece of bronze, heated red hot, and they would put the rod, that hot, glowing red hot piece of metal, underneath that bone where they'd written the question. And when the bone cracked, then the religious leader would read the cracks and tell you the answer to your questions. It's a kind of a questionable way to get a yes or no answer, but the examples of writing on these oracle bones are some of the earliest known examples of Chinese writing. So there's your video on China. Looking forward to seeing how you do on the assessment. I'll see you in the Zoom.